Okay, let's start. Um, First of all, big thanks to everyone for joining this virtual launch of my first poetry book, Borrowed Light, which is here. There we go. It's won the 2020 Red Mountain Press Discovery Award. It's nice to be discovered at any age. You can order the book if you like, if you're uncontrollably inspired, by going to my website, kenhaas.org, or to the Red Mountain Press website, both of which link to the distributor and some other options. It's also available through Amazon and Goodreads. And yes, I did say the A word. Some quick logistics. I'm thrilled that Joe Millar has offered to introduce me and will do so shortly, after which I'll read for about 15 minutes and then open the event up for questions and chat. In line with what I think is the general practice for these events, I'm starting out with everyone muted, but the chat function is enabled so you can make comments or ask questions as we go, which I will try and respond to during the second part of the event. I'd also like to let everyone know that we're recording this in case I say something profound that I can't remember tomorrow. Joe Millar is not only one of the best poets writing today, but he's also one of the best people and coolest guys around. I'm honored to call him a friend. He's been a true mentor to me for almost 2 decades. He helped me edit this book. He's the author of 4 terrific and diverse poetry volumes: Fortune, Blue Rust, Overtime, and Kingdom. Overtime is still one of my all-time favorites. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, has won a Pushcart Prize, and teaches in the MFA program at Pacific University. So Joe, thanks, and please kick us off.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay.
I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's good. You better wait and see. Well, it's a privilege and an honor to do this for my friend Ken, whose poems I have admired for many years, and who started out a long time ago now as a student of mine at Esalen in one of the workshops there, workshop called Writing and Knowing. And I could see right from the beginning that we had affinities for the same kinds of subjects, poems of identity a lot. This is where I come from. This is what my family was like. We're both Giants fans. We both like jazz. And, so over the years, I have seen this volume in various incarnations. And I must say that it's very different from when I first looked at it, and much more accomplished. Now, usually a first volume of poems tends to be a book of identity. Sort of, this is my parents, this is my landscape that I grew up in, this is what I remember, this is what we watched on the TV, or this is where I went to school. But when you're a little further along in years, you have quite a lot of things to look back on, more so than maybe somebody whose first collection comes out when they're 26 or even younger now, the way things are in the poetry world. But this is also the way poetry works is you write a lot of poems and you only get to keep a few of them. And so there are really a lot of poems that ended up, and a lot of lines and a lot of images that ended up on the cutting room floor for this fine book. And you'll get a feeling for Ken's subject matter and his voice as we go along. It's an American voice, first and foremost. Those of you of a certain age will recognize the eras that he speaks of in various poems. And I know you're going to enjoy this reading, and I know I'm going to enjoy it. So, Ken, take it away, bud.
Thanks, Joe. Love you, bro. So I'm going to read 7 poems from the book, 1 or 2 from each of the 4 sections, which move generally from a Bronx and New Jersey childhood, then backward in time to an exploration of family history, including my parents and grandparents on both sides, escape from Nazi Germany, then forward again to my own migration west to the Bay Area more than 40 years ago, and finally to my discovery, which is ever ongoing, of love, relationship, and the larger world. I'd like to read each of the following poems for someone or someones who may be listening in, and I'll be more specific about that as we go along. This first poem is about my generation's war and features my mother and baseball. As most of you know, there was a draft for Vietnam. The induction sequence was determined by a lottery held once a year during the summer and televised. A low number meant you were headed either for basic training or for Canada. A number higher than about 125 meant you were safe. And I'm going to read this from my boyhood pals, particularly Barry, Mark, and Howard, also known as Shorty. It's called Lottery Day 1970. We're taking infield practice and shagging flies, Jersey heat dripping from the bills of our caps, black magic woman on a distant transistor, kids splashing and shouting in the public pool. The ribbing and the girl talk are on low. Someone hits a ball into the tennis courts. A man in white shorts throws it back gently. Today, the war is coming home. In an hour, my mother will meet me at the door, still in her nightgown, having watched TV all day as blue plastic capsules were drawn from 2 separate drums, one of which was full of birthdays. A Winston in her hand, her eyes will be red, but she'll be smiling. All she will say is 316. I backhand a grounder near second. The shortstop turns 2. Crickets are out at noon. We're all friends. We're all 19. Our moms at home glued to flickering screens while we're out playing the game we know. This next piece is about my paternal grandmother, who literally saved our family by convincing my stubborn grandfather to leave Germany just before Kristallnacht in 1938. My grandfather was a patriot. He fought on the German side in World War I and thought everything was going to be just fine. This grandmother later taught me about classical music and particularly adored the Puccini opera, Madame Butterfly, which is not particularly celebrated these days because the narrative is about a Japanese woman who is loved and left by an American ship captain and then slits her throat to save her own family. but the music is stunningly moving. And I'm going to read this from my cousin, Michael Blumenthal, also a poet. This grandmother was his great aunt. Madame Butterfly. She was the kindest woman anyone knew, though to me, the grandma who wanted to talk when the Yankees were on, how school was, if I had nice friends, her pastille breath, galore perfume, and mashed potato breasts, the organs of suffocation. Armchair bound by gout, with a taut bob of pewter hair, ringed by jardinières of lilies, she fed me apples with the tart skin pared off in splendid curls. Her grasp of the undeniable had saved a family, moved a stiff-necked man to quit their homeland where he was sure reason would return. But as she would tell me when we had taken in yet again the scuffed rendering of her favorite Puccini, and I had remarked on the stupidity of the heroine's devotion to a jerk, the story is just housing for the music, which I've repeated since to dates in business suits, appalled by Butterfly's sacrifice, the blade of her voice calling to those who have lost the trail of love, that you can start again here, boxed in brilliance, hanging by a thread. A little about this next poem. The prince of my youth was my father's brother, Uncle Heinz, or Henry as we called him. He was a consummate violinist back in Germany in his teens, but lost his career when Hitler took over. Jews were not allowed to study music under the new laws. So Heinz joined the family business instead and became a baker. Two pieces of modern art have always reminded me of him. First, he was remarkably like the main character in the film Life is Beautiful, in that he had this almost alchemical ability to turn pain and misfortune into humor and joy. And secondly, there's a painting by Marc Chagall, after which this poem is titled, which always makes me think of this special man. And I'm going to read this from my cousin Arlene, who is Heinz's daughter. The Blue Violinist, after Marc Chagall, 1947. The blue violinist is not blue. His face is orange, hands white, hair and eyes black, while just about everything else is blue. His bench, his socks, the sparrows on his lap, houses and fences, the night air, even some leaves, various shades of the same blue. His world seems to want him also to be blue, except for the violin, which is golden. And the blue baker was not a baker. Uncle Heinz was a violinist, when only those with a Führer's nose were authorized to play. Violinist with knuckles white from flour, cheeks warmed red, while the shirts and the trucks were brown. The bricks and smoke and tongues, even the Edelweiss along the muddy river, aspects of the same brown, except for the shoes, whose color could not be discerned. Uncle Heinz baked and baked, like his father and father's father, baked before he left and on the boat over, baked for a new army in the Pacific and where he settled in the Bronx, baked violinist rolls, lady fingers, coffee rings, and macaroons, which came out of the ovens golden. Switching now to San Francisco and a lighter piece. This is about the Giants, some baseball again, which I'm going to read for all my friends in this, my second hometown. It's called The Catch. Night game at Candlestick toward the end of its days. June Rockwell, season ticket holder of the So-So Giants, has lured me out to see the wretched Cubs. First date. When I pick her up, she asks if I've brought my glove. And I tell her I'm from the Bronx, where we do everything with our bare hands. Thin crowd, uneventful innings until 2 out in the 7th, when Chicago's lumbering, chaw-spitting right fielder nicks a rising heater that sails backward several sections from our box seats into a circular gale like the Twister in Wizard of Oz, the ball at its apex, still no real concern, 20 rows away. And yet, in its final moments, the object of common regard begins to beam intently, inevitably, from my patron's unarmed lap. I, Bud Light in one hand, fully adorned bratwurst in the other, no kidding, I refuse to panic. So the hot dog becomes, at last, the missing glove, explodes like a grenade as the seamed orb makes exceptional contact. When, after a decent interval, I look up, June, standing now, a Jackson Pollock of ballpark cuisine, tinsels of pork rind and sauerkraut in her startled hair, glitter of mustard and relish from brow to chin, says not a word, does not go to wash up, just lowers her quivering body. The wind dies, the home team fails, we do not speak on the drive back. Ah, what might have been, but not for me. I'm romantic in that other way, this way, for this night, no, if only will ever rival what happened. Watch as we reach June's flat. She turns, caked still with the spectacle I have made of gallantry, and kisses me. Softly, briefly, decisively. Watch the fog rise to claim her for the perfect past. This next poem also has to do with the relationship between what happened, what we remember, and what we tell. I spent a good chunk of my middle years dating and in medium-term relationships, though when I had each of my now 3 colonoscopies, I was not in a relationship and so had to find someone to drive me. I'm going to read this from my writing group, otherwise known as the Posse, Amanda, Janet, Barb, Sean, Davika, and Pat. The title, which probably will be obvious, is a made-up word. It's called the colonoscopy. There ought to be a Greek name for the ex-lovers who, because the clinic won't let you drive yourself or take a cab, come pick you up and take you home from the outpatient procedure where you were drugged to disremember what went on with that sleek fiber optic tube. More specifically, in my case, Christine, when I was 51, whose bulimic daughter had drowned herself in the jacuzzi. At 58, Lee, public defender whose pederast client was out shopping again in the Oakland Walmart. At 63, Maria, who had just learned her uncle was her father. I wasn't supposed to be single at those ages, but a wife could not have kept it so simple. Would have had questions, taken care of me in unwanted ways, not understood there was an art to forgetting. And these women, who long consigned to the list of friends I rarely saw, answered the call without asking, drove the 2 miles quietly, past the Shell, the Save Mart, the Pat Park Carousel, giving me time to fill my mind again with a camp out in Haleakala Crater, silver swords in the eyes of old pack mules glazed by the Milky Way. With hula hoops naked, leading to reverse cowgirl in a rocking chair on a rotten porch in Chico. With Mahler's Sixth, 2 days after 9/11, the cellists in tears. The closest might be Minazame, goddess of recall, who slept with Zeus for 9 straight nights, not because he was nice, but because he had experience. Then bore the muses, who knew instinctively the need in their work for memory. Not so much of what happened, but to replace what happened with what can be told. Field songs sung to the freeborn grandkids. Volta scratched on a bedpost. Woolly mammoth brushed in its own bright blood on the walls of a Spanish cave. Continuing in a slightly different vein with the theme of what actually happened or not. This next to last poem is a somewhat grouchy, edgy piece, which I'm going to read for Joe Millar, who shares my interest in ironic meditations on aging. It's called Wells Fargo. Hunched right behind me in Kafka's bank line, an octogenarian with 49ers cap askew and white stubble as old as his last floss, grunts, slowest in the Western states. So I ask him how he knows, and he snorts, "Don't be a smartass." Informs me he's hiding from the social director of his assisted living center, volunteers some inside scoop on the distant tellers. One only does wire transfers to South America, the other isn't yet trained to handle cash. A supervisor with the name tag Jerry is cruising the crowd, ready to apologize in English, Spanish, or Tagalog for whatever no one else is sorry about. The old dude tells him he's feeling estranged from his capital, says, "All I need are a couple of crisp hundreds to give as Christmas tips to my barber and my life coach." Jerry offers him a dum-dum and some hand sanitizer with aloe. I offer to get him scratch paper so he can write a poem. He mumbles, "Roses are black, my nose just bled, and my balls itch, so I'm not dead." Then he asks if we can switch places. "Time is running out faster for me," he says, at which point I have to question whether any of this actually happened, or if it's just a talk I'm having with myself 20 years from now, in line for something else I think is mine, or I want to buy, or I've already paid for. This last poem is about back scratching, which is relevant to all generations, though seems to become increasingly important and meaningful as we approach Medicare. There's some wordplay at the end around the title, which may or may not be obvious, and there are some anatomical words relating to muscle and skin. And I'm going to read this from my amazing partner, Susan. It's called Itch. I can't think right now about the endangered sage grouse or the new translation of Catullus. What I need is a mechanical pencil, tip pointed skyward behind my back, somewhere equivocal between rhomboid major and latissimus dorsi along one of the intercostal nerves. Except the pencil is vertically challenged, can't reach my wherever from any contorted obliquity, and the coat hanger is an idiot, or the place just doesn't exist in the physical world, which I would believe to my utter distraction by spatulas and golf clubs, carrots and doorknobs, were it not for you, my dear, who can find any latitude of fugitives or longitude of ghosts, deep in the dermis or on the corneum's dry bed, with your unfiled nails with some blind direction. Left a little, no, too much, back the other way. Sure, we can visit your stepsister in Poland. Under the t-shirt, please. The longer strokes. The word comes from Old English, and before that, Old Norse. Try concentric circles, or the symbol for infinity. So I'm in a long line of sufferers, from Edward the Confessor to Eric the Red. Down now, a bit more dig, almost draw blood. Yes, right there. Keep going, just like that. Or else it returns, it churns, it chews, it chills, it chirps, imagined brush to brush. It charts your touch, it chooses when. Scratch me to sleep. Tomorrow we'll do important things. The motorcycle was not planned, but we'll have to have him come back. Maybe he has a role to play. So anyway, thanks to everyone a lot for listening. Susan has been kindly monitoring, Susan who's right here, has been monitoring the chat as I've been reading. So I'll ask her to see if there are questions and to highlight them for me. It looks like we've got, well, over 50 participants. I didn't think I actually knew that many people. But at that level, it might be a tad chaotic to have everyone unmute all at once. So maybe we'll start by either pose some questions via chat or raise your hand in the participant window, and we'll try to figure out how to call on you. While you're formulating or not, maybe I'll take on one or two questions that I've seen either come in via chat or have come up in the past. I think maybe something to start out with is a question we've all been asking ourselves lately, namely, what's the role of poetry in the time of Corona? On this one, I would conjure the poet Ed Hirsch, who has said generally that a poem is like a message in a bottle, a note from one person on an island, often an emotional, psychological, or spiritual island, to another unknown person, possibly also in solitude, literally or metaphorically. It's a note saying, as Joe kind of alluded to, this is what happened to me, this is who I am, this is what I hope for. Since we're all effectively on islands right now, I think the need for those messages in bottles seems greater than ever. The need to make others feel less alone, make ourselves feel less isolated by the mere thought that someone might hear us and say, I feel that too. So I think it's an important time for poets and poetry, and we're all, trying to be active in that regard. Let's see. Anyone dying to? Okay, great. Yeah, my friend Barry wants to ask a question. We'll see if we can figure out how to unmute.
Got me?
You got him. Okay.
How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you.
This is awesome.
This is my good friend Barry from the schoolyard.
We lived catty-corner from each other around the schoolyard. So I've had a chance to know Ken for a long, long time, almost 60 years. And,
okay, I think it's time to mute him again now.
And I want to say something, which is, A, this is phenomenal, and I couldn't be happier for you and for all of us who get to appreciate and listen to you. 20 or so years ago, I was reading some of your poetry. I loved it, and why don't you publish it? And around that time, maybe it was 20, 25 years ago, you said, but that would defeat the purpose. And I'm wondering what happened so that it is the purpose now for you to let it out there in the world.
It's a great question. And it's interesting, right? You know, when you first start out, I think especially, you know, someone who's not going to make a career of it, it's about the poem. And you sort of feel like if you write with the intention to publish or to put it out in the world, that you've got somebody looking over your shoulder that you don't want looking over your shoulder. A, because it's going to impact the poem,
Yep.
And B, because you know, the joy is in the writing. You know, I always say the best thing about writing poetry is writing poetry. The second best thing is being part of the poetry community, which is a great community. So what happens is, as you go along, because it's such a great community, what people do, people like Joe, a lot of other, you know, people on this video who are friends and supporters and co-writers, you know, they start to say, you know, that's really good. That, you know, took me 8 years before anyone said it was really good, but, you know, I was willing to wait. So they say, that's really good. You should send that out. I mean, that's the phrase, you know, send it out to a magazine. And at first you resist it, but then you come to the view that the poem is almost like an independent entity. It's a friend that wants a life of its own, or at least, you know, you convince yourself of that, because that's what everybody else in the poetry community believes. And so you start to send it out. That cycles, you know, after a while you get one published, and then you get two published, and, you know, that feels good. And so you do more of it. And so at some point after, you know, probably 10 years of writing, I had 50 poems published in various magazines. And then the same people come and say, you should do a book. And then it's the same, you know, same process. You think about it, you know, do I really want that amount of ego involvement? But then you think, okay, the poem should be out there. And if there's a publisher out there that thinks it's good enough, I'll put it out there and publish it. And then what you find is that it's the same process. You know, it takes, you know, 5 years for anyone to really recognize it, and you revise it every year. Joe knows this process well, since he's part of it for his own books, and, you know, certainly was an advisor for me, and basically saying, you know, this is good, but it could be better. And that happened, you know, 5 times in 5 years. And then finally, you know, Red Mountain Press, Susan Gardner is the editor and publisher, you know, liked it enough to give it an award and to say, I'll publish it. And that's sort of how it happened. And I think, you know, after a while, through listening to friends and mentors, you get a feeling, and I got a feeling, that I could still write what I wanted to write with that shadow hanging over of, you know, is someone going to like this? Is it going to be published? You know, et cetera, which is not a bad thing. I mean, it's a reasonable selection criteria, you know, but, you know, if you're Emily Dickinson, you know, it doesn't matter whether you get published or not. But if you're not, which I'm not, you know, it's nice to be published. Interesting. So this is an interesting question. Someone says, love the Giants poem. Are you more drawn to perverse or sharp, observant humor? I think so. I mean, I think, you know, growing up where Barry and I grew up, irony, sarcasm was a mode of survival, and that becomes part of the voice. And I think it's an important, you know, it's a voice I don't always bring out. But it's an important part of the poetic voice because it, praises what should be praised and it criticizes what should be criticized, and it's funny. Humor is sort of important, but I think it's part of who I am. And in the question of am I drawn to it, is an interesting question because I do get tired of it sometimes. I mean, it's a voice that I'll be writing a poem and it comes out and it dominates the poem, and no, this is not what this poem wants, is not what I want for this poem. So there's another good question, which I'll answer. Over how many years were the poems written and how many changes from first iteration? Yeah, so I would say the poems were probably written. I started writing I'd always dabbled in poetry, but I started writing in earnest about 20 years ago. It was a workshop at Esalen, not with Joe, it was with a poet named Richard Jones, but shortly after that, Joe and Ellen Bass and Joe's poet wife, Dorianne Laux, were doing workshops at Esalen, and so that was the beginning of it. So I'd say, some of these poems were first drafted 15 years ago. And, I think, again, as most poets know, I mean, some of the poems went through 20 versions, 20 iterations, because they were terrible or they had to be reordered, or there was too much or too little, or, you just spend days searching for the right word. I mean, that happens, and it's why poets like writing poetry. It's about the words. Joe, who I think has muted himself but could speak for himself, used to say, tell me, if you've got 3 kids and you want to know, which one's the poet, take them on a ride, through a cornfield or something like that. And the poet's the one, or through a farm where there are apples. And the poet's the one who's sitting in the back seat mumbling to himself, apple, snapple, bapple, dapple, grapple, etc. Wordplay. And so a lot of poems go through a lot of, not just mine, but everyone's go through many, many drafts, in part just, to get the words right, which was fun. What was the hardest moment in being publication, and what tool helped me overcome the obstacles? I think the hardest thing was just the time spent, because it takes a lot of time to send poems out. You send 6 poems out to 15 journals and, nada. And, it's not the rejection, because everyone gets rejected. It's sort of part of the business. But it's looking back then on the time spent, because you'd rather be writing or kayaking or, doing, whatever. So I think it's the time. The time is kind of the hardest process. For me, it's not the rejection. I think for some people it is the rejection, because it happens so often. Even the best poets get accepted 10% of the time. So it's just the time you have to spend sending stuff out and writing the letters and that kind of stuff. How does your work sound differently now that it lives in a book? And anything you seriously rethought just before the book was released? I'd say the poems were all formed, many of them formed a long time ago. And then every year I would take 3 or 4 out and put 4 or 5 new ones in to try and, improve the book, on a continuous basis. And I always knew that thematically as Joe said, when you first start writing, the first olives out of the bottle, so to speak, are family, life narrative type poems. That was sort of true in my case. But I think the main thing in doing the book is getting the right poems in, which means every year, you add 3 or 4 new ones, and you have to, as Allen Ginsberg says, you have to kill your darlings, so there are poems in there that you think are fabulous. And then you realize, people like Joe who look at them and say, you've got better ones than this, or you got 6 poems about your grandfather, pick the best 2, and those, the experts, like Joe and Kwame Dawes also, who works with Joe at Pacific, is a terrific editor, and he had similar comments. So I think, the book changed a little bit over time, but not dramatically. It always had a section about growing up, a section about family, looking backwards, a section about being out here in love and relationship, and a section about, the world and nature. What was the hardest thing, and I think what changed the most, is the order, which, I never thought order in a book is important, but it's hugely important, and I'm still not sure I got it right. And that if I had second thoughts just before it was published, it was about, did I get the order right? I would say, a decade ago, maybe even up to 5 years ago, the thought about order, the main thought about order, was get your 4 themes or 3 themes or whatever it is, and then have 3 or 4 sections and mix up the themes. So have a poem about growing up, then a poem about family, then a poem about nature, then a poem about love, and just mix them up. So you're not too predictable, you're surprising, etc. That is still a kind of major thought, but to some degree it's been overtaken by a thought of going back to the way some books used to be, where the themes are all clustered in sections. So as I do in this book, there's kind of a section, there's a little bit of mix up, but there's kind of a section, starting with growing up, then as I said, looking backwards to family, then going forward to San Francisco, and then sort of branching out to the greater world. And so the book has a bit of an arc to it. And I think the world, to some extent, the poetry world has changed back to that a little bit, in part because there are more theme books being written now. There are more books, thankfully, by more diverse poets who are writing their story, and that story has a bit of an arc to it, time-wise or otherwise. And so there are more kind of theme books being written. That has, I think, brought the order back a little bit more to arc as opposed to mix. I don't know whether Joe agrees or disagrees with that, but he'll tell me over a beer sometime. And so my favorite stanza forms is from Brenda Hillman, great poet, wonderful friend, and great mentor also. I'm experimenting with form now. The form just sort of came out in blobs, and then I kind of changed some of the forms and I experimented with form. But now I'm trying to actually write first drafts in forms. There are some form poems in the book. There's a villanelle, there's a couple of sonnets, and then there's poems in couplet, I think, no couplets, but I think there's one in tercets and another in quatrains. So there is some form in the book. I would say that my favorite form is the villanelle. There's something about which for those who may not know, is a form where the lines kind of repeat themselves. It's a form that is in versets, which are 3-line stanzas, and then the last stanza is a quatrain. And so lines, first and third lines kind of repeat themselves, and then those lines come together in the end. And there's something, just beautifully rhythmic and poetic and challenging about it. And, the thing I use form for most is to create surprise for myself. Sometimes it's hard to create surprise, but if you have to fit within a certain form and a word has to rhyme with another word, there may only be 6 words that rhyme with that word, and you got to choose from the 6, and all of a sudden you realize, wow, that one's amazing, because you never would have thought of it. So form, there's a forcing function in form, that I like. Villanelle is my current favorite, although I was in a workshop recently where we had to write what are called ghazals, where the repetition is more kind of the last word. And I got a lot out of that. So I'm going to be working a little bit more with form. I actually, I suppose this qualifies as form. I've, over the last 5 years, as kind of just a lark, I've written a fair amount of what's called concrete poetry, which is also known as visual poetry. It's poems that have a long tradition going all the way back to Greek Alexandria. Apollinaire's Collograms is probably one of the most famous. And these are poems where the words are organized in kind of a visual format, the form of some sort of picture or visual. So it has both a visual and a traditional, poetic, linguistic effect, but it has a visual effect. And if you're lucky, the visual and the linguistic kind of speak to each other. So it's a fun format to try either off the bat or halfway through a poem. You think, wow, this would look cool as a car, So I've been doing a lot of that. I've got about 50 of these things in a draft manuscript. It's going to take a lot of work to get this thing, not the least of which is that probably no one's going to want to publish it because it's difficult when you're dealing with stuff that's kind of all over the page. Does that just mean what forms you choose, your experimental form? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a really good question and one I've been thinking a lot about. For those who may not know, I mein, Brenda really works with form and how poems look on the page. I remember once asking her, do you kind of write it in a blob and then you rearrange it? And her answer was, no, that's just how I write. As I write, it kind of moves around on the page. I'm not there yet. I'm still too stuck, I think, in the narrative form. And, I think have been, I wouldn't say retraining myself, but re-experimenting, just using just different forms of experimentation so that, when the words come out on the page, they move around in interesting ways. So I don't know how good at that I will be. Not as good as Brenda, I can assure you. I'll maybe just answer one more question, and then since we're getting to 4, I'll try to wrap it up. But thanks everyone for these great questions. Someone asked me to talk about the writing process, when, where, what is a good day's work. So everyone writes pretty differently. There are a lot of folks who I think get a lot out of writing for 2 hours. I think Mary Oliver said she had a touch whenever she got up, she would write for 2 hours and every day, and that was a discipline. And if she had nothing to write, she would make herself sit there for 2 hours. I'm more of a collector. I go through the world, see things, poetically, see things in words, come back, write them down on a, post-it note or on a piece of paper, and then over time add to it. And so at any given time, I might have 20 sheets of paper that are poems in the making, which I will, over months, just add little blobs to, ideas, thoughts, phrases, words, something I overheard on the street, something totally surprising. I like to, add surprise and figure out how to do that. And that's why you just walk around and you say, wow, that's weird. It belongs, wow, it could be in this poem. And so these pages have sticky notes all over the place and blobs of notes all over the place. And then when I have time to write, I go through these pages and think, okay, what am I in the mood? What does my mood say I want to write? Because you have to have the writing energy for that poem, I find. And you can't just sit down and say, I should write this poem if you don't have the energy for it. So I'll go back and I'll think, wow, I'm kind of in the mood to write this poem now. And then I'll sit down and do a draft and, kind of start that way. So it's an odd process, but it's the one that's fun for me. And it fits with my lifestyle since I don't really have, specific slots of time, and I don't want to be that disciplined. I want it still, to be a lot of fun. Okay, this I think is a good time to wrap it up. And I had something that I wanted to just read briefly if I can find it. Some people may have noticed that I sponsor a weekly poetry writing workshop in the UCSF Children's Hospitals in Oakland and in San Francisco. I started out, initially taught the workshop myself to make sure it was viable, and then I turned it over to 2 great teachers, and Sally, who took it over and have done it now weekly for 10 years. The results have been, spectacular, heartwarming, heart healing, and in some cases heartbreaking, because many of the heroic, and I do mean heroic, young writers have passed on. But it's an integral part of the hospital now. And the children, write amazing stuff. Once a year, we publish an anthology and have a public reading. So, I'd urge you maybe to contact me and let me know if you'd like to come to that. And when I'm feeling really sorry for myself, it's their poems that I read. So again, just in wrapping things up, I just want to thank everyone for joining and supporting me. I think I should just acknowledge the times in which we live, and not just C-19, but the political situation, George Floyd and his brothers and sisters, our brothers and sisters, those who are, still being harassed, or worse, those of us who may be sick or have lost a loved one or a job. I've taken my guitar out of hiding these past months, though I'm afraid if I actually sang something, I'd be accused of Zoom bombing my own event. So I'm not going to sing. Though if I did, I'd probably go with the Stephen Foster song, Hard Times Coming in No More. But you can go online and listen to Mavis Staples sing that. And that will be a good part of your day. So instead, what I'm going to do is just end with a 4-line poem by one of the UCSF children. It was written by Josh in 2015. And it's called Spoon, and it's a poem that I love. And it goes like this. My form is at least 100 years old. I'm plastic or metal, silver or gold. You use me at least 3 times a day. I once had a lover and we ran away. So I'm going to end on that. And again, thank everyone. I love you. And email me if you have more questions.